Good evening, everyone. I hope you all are having a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for joining us as you are coming into the Zoom room. We would love to hear where you're joining us from tonight, whether it's in North Carolina or if it's from another state. You can put that in the chat. We would love to hear from you. So we'll get started here. And hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Giblin, Director of North Carolina Center for the Book at North Carolina Humanities. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's North Carolina Reads Book Club discussion of Doc Watson, A Life in Music with Eddie Huffman and Mark Freed. This is our fifth and final book discussion of our 2025 North Carolina Reads program, and we are so glad that you are here. Now in its fourth year, North Carolina Reads annually features 5 books that explore the history and culture of North Carolina. The people, places, and events in these books offer an opportunity to reflect on how people can contribute to shaping their communities. As a nonpartisan statewide nonprofit, and as North Carolina's affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, our mission at NC Humanities is to connect North Carolinians with cultural experiences that spur dialogue, deepen human connections, and inspire community. This evening features a moderated discussion on Doc Watson, A Life in Music, which is our 2025 North Carolina Reads selection for June. As a note about this evening's program, North Carolina Reads books are intended for readers 18 and over, and this program contains content that may be sensitive to some. We would like to acknowledge the National Endowment for the Humanities, the State Library of North Carolina, and McGuire Woods for their sponsorship support of this year's program. Please note any views, findings, conclusions, opinions, or recommendations expressed by our partners and participants do not necessarily represent those of NC Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Before we begin, we will briefly discuss a few housekeeping points for this evening's event and how to engage with us. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session on our YouTube channel at NC Humanities. Closed captions are available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. There will be a question and answer period after the moderated discussion. If you have a question, please click on the Q&A icon to submit your question. It is my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator, Cecelia Thompson. Cecelia Thompson serves as Executive Director of Action Greensboro. Action Greensboro, together with the Chamber of Commerce, serves the city's primary economic and community development agency. Action Greensboro works to strengthen Greensboro's economy and ensure the continuation of its excellent quality of life. Cecelia also serves as an NC Humanities Board Trustee. Cecelia, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I'm really glad to be here today on behalf of North Carolina Humanities Board and moderating a conversation with both the author of Doc Watson, A Life in Music, and a North Carolina expert in Doc Watson. And I must say that I knew nothing about Doc Watson until I had the pleasure of reading this book. And so really excited to dig into more detail about the book and really hear from Eddie and Mark firsthand. And so first, I'm just going to introduce both of them. Eddie's bio is definitely a new one for me, and you'll hear that in his bio. So Eddie Huffman is a 9th or 10th generation North Carolinian who has been writing about music legends, muscle cars, obscenity trials, moonshiners, Civil War reenactors, and murderous ventriloquist dummies since before Lady Gaga was born. John Prine, In Spite of Himself, is the first book he has written on his own. He has contributed to Rolling Stone, the New York Times, All Music Guide, Goldmine, and the Virgin Islands Source, as well as many other publications. Eddie, welcome. We're really glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Cecelia. Glad to be here.
Mark Freed works as the Director of Cultural Resources for the town of Boone and serves as adjunct instructor of Appalachian music at Appalachian State University, where he's been teaching since 2005, when he finished his master's degree at App Studies. Freed helped start and lead the Doc Watson Day celebration, which began when a downtown Boone statue of Doc Watson was unveiled in June of 2011. Mark lives in Boone with his family and a wall of banjos, which is behind him tonight. So welcome, welcome. So we're going to just jump right into these questions. And I'm going to start with Eddie. We learned a little about this in sort of the introduction in the book, but what led you to write this book about Doc Watson? Explain the style of music that Doc is known for and how his music fits really into the larger context of Appalachian music.
Sure. Well, Doc Watson is a North Carolina legend, but the reason I wrote the book, the short reason is very simple. I was asked to write the book. My editor is from Watauga County. Lucas Church is from Boone, and this is with UNC Press in Chapel Hill. And Lucas wanted a book from his part of the state, and Doc was a very obvious choice for someone to write about. And Lucas liked my first book, which is about John Prine, singer-songwriter, and saw that I was local and just thought I'd be a good fit for a Doc Watson book. So that's the short answer on that. And I had interviewed Doc. I saw him a number of times, been to Merle Fest a number of times, so I was fairly familiar with him. Let's see, but yeah, he a lot of people try to classify Doc as bluegrass. He did not like to be called bluegrass, did not consider himself a bluegrass musician. Uh, Sort of an early Americana musician, I think you might say, drawing from folk, blues, country, a little bit of jazz, just a lot of different sources. And the music he grew up with in Watauga County, but a lot of outside sources as well. Music he heard on the radio and on records growing up. Big fan of Merle Travis, who he named his son after. Just Doc drew from a lot of different influences and ended up becoming one of the most influential guitar players in the world. I can talk more about that as we go along, but the I guess the basics there are that there was basically traditional acoustic guitar playing in traditional music before Doc and after Doc, and pretty much anybody who plays in any sort of traditional music style now is influenced directly or indirectly by Doc Watson.
Thank you. I was really taken in the book and inspired by sort of like these hidden talents and perseverance of this story. And so, Mark, maybe I'll start with you. Can you talk about some of the challenges that Doc Watson faced in his early years and how his childhood and adolescence really shaped him?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, growing up in Watauga County was a huge impact, and in Deep Gap, in rural part of Watauga County, where his family was certainly had a very subsistence style lifestyle, and a lot of hard work, and a big family with lots of siblings and family and neighbors around him, surrounded by a community. Obviously, as most people know, but just in case you don't, he was blind and at a very young age, and so that had probably the biggest impact on him. I mean, he said, I think numerous times throughout his life that had he not been, he probably would have worked as a mechanic or done something with his hands in another way. He was very in he was great at working with his hands. He wired his house, and he would get out and change his. There's a great documentary film that you can stream on folkstreams.net that was made on about Doc, and there's some great footage of Doc and Merle. Where he's up on the roof putting his storm windows on, and he's putting a handle on a tool chest on, and he one of the very impactful stories that he talked about as a young man was when his father put him on one side of a crosscut saw and put him to work. And he said that really gave him this feeling of, knowing that he could pull his own weight and be worthy as a young man. And I think that really instilled an ethic of hard work with him. He would travel from Deep Gap to Boone to play music on the streets, which wouldn't have been a terribly easy travel. It would have been fairly regular, but not terribly easy, especially for a blind boy to come in and play music on the streets. So I think the perseverance of growing up in a rural county and with those disability challenges as well really instilled a lot of his life traits.
Yeah, and sort of woven through, Eddie, you did such a good job of sort of painting a picture almost of North Carolina history, and like the building of the Blue Ridge Parkway and the storm in chapter one, like really reminded me of like how maybe like every 100 years you have one of those storms that, you remember in that way. And we've certainly seen that lately. So,
Sure.
add anything to that question just about challenges that Doc faced as a child?
Let's see. Well, blindness was first and foremost, as Mark mentioned. Um, let's see. And yeah, the family was very poor. They basically, I think I mentioned in the book, the only thing they ate that they didn't grow or kill themselves, basically, they had farm animals, they hunted, they had gardens. I think coffee and sugar were really the only two things that they ate that weren't, um, they didn't produce themselves. So yeah, and it was a big family, just a lot of mouths to feed. So that was a big factor. Let's see. But Doc had a very supportive family. I think some of the biggest challenges came when he went to the School for the Blind and Deaf in Raleigh as a child. He didn't start at regular school age. I think he was maybe around 9 or 10
Yeah.
when he started school. And it was a very different era. And Mark mentioned how Doc's dad put him to work, made him feel like he could really accomplish things, and that was really not the atmosphere at the school in Raleigh. Um, it was it, there was a lot of abuse there, unfortunately,
Mm.
and just Doc did not like Doc was actually slapped one time for playing country music. The teachers thought it was sort of embarrassing that he's playing country music, and in those days, basically the only music lessons were classical music, and um, the teacher thought Doc was conceited and sort of embarrassing playing country music. So, and I think there was just that sort of general atmosphere. Ronnie Millsap, another blind musician from North Carolina, went to that same school about 10 years later and told similar stories. It just was not a good atmosphere. So, Doc didn't last very long there. Came back home after about 4 years. And yeah, I guess another challenge was just how to make money, and he started playing on the street at a fairly young age, and that was for a long time that was his primary means of making money, was just playing for nickels and dimes on the streets in Boone and Lenore and Mountain City, Tennessee, and other places in the area.
Yeah, it
To
really is
to
very
circle back to
important.
the sorry, to circle back to the school of the blind though, I mean, how fortunate that he also gave him an opportunity to hear some music that was very impressionable on him and to learn his some of his first guitar chords. And I was fascinating, Eddie, that you dug up the story of him hearing Helen Keller speak.
Mm.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, he mentioned that. I think maybe in one of his he did some sessions with David Holt, played with David Holt a good bit later in his life. And they did a kind of a storyteller tour for several years where David would interview Doc on stage. I think the Helen Keller story may have come from one of those. There we go, one of the David Holt connections. But yeah, Helen Keller actually came to speak in Raleigh in like 1935, something like that, and was advocating for a some sort of state department to support blind people. And Doc and other kids from the school went to hear her speak at Raleigh Memorial Auditorium. But yeah, you mentioned Doc learning his first guitar chords. That was a fun little detail for me. I grew up occasionally watching the Uncle Paul show on WRAL TV out of Raleigh, and Uncle Paul was Paul Montgomery, who went to school with Doc and taught him his first guitar chords. So, just lots of interesting little threads that, as Cecelia mentioned, a lot of North Carolina history there,
Mhm.
and just a lot of interesting details that I was happy to uncover.
Very cool. Very cool. Thanks for bringing that up, Mark, about Helen Keller. I was like, this is just so fascinating, sort of the weaving of the storyline. So this is a question for both of you. So you guys chime in as you wish. What are your impressions of Doc Watson's early performing and recording career? Were there some of the influences of his musicians, and how did they influence his own music? I want to elaborate on that a little bit.
I mean,
You
I
go
think
first,
one of
Mark.
the really fascinating things that I found in the that somebody talked about in the book, Eddie, and maybe you can expound on this a little bit, but that by the time, Doc had come around to a career in music, he was pretty seasoned performer, or at least by the time that we get a chance, an opportunity to hear him. And it was somebody who said something about, he had nowhere to go but down. Because he came in as such a just a hot player, and those early
Oh
recordings
yeah.
with him, I mean, it's he's not a young man. He's somebody who had been playing. He'd put in his 10,000 hours and then some by that point for sure, playing in VFWs and dance halls and schoolhouses and street corners. And so he had really honed it in. And coming out of the gate as far as a recording career and a career outside of this region, I mean, he was already on fire and top notch.
Eddie?
Absolutely. Yeah. He and just I guess I'll briefly mention a little bit about how he developed his technique. Mark was talking about him playing, VFW halls and square dances and that sort of thing. And one way he developed his guitar technique was playing fiddle parts on guitar. The fiddle player wouldn't always show up for the dances, and Doc was basically recreating fiddle parts, and that had a lot to do with his style. But another sort of interesting detail that I discovered along the way is that he didn't play acoustic guitar for many years leading up to becoming a well-known musician. He couldn't really afford an acoustic guitar and an electric guitar, and he needed an electric guitar to be heard over the rest of the band when he was playing dances. So sold his Martin D18 acoustic in the early 50s and bought an early Les Paul electric guitar. And that was his only guitar for the next 8 or 9 years, probably. But yeah, so he was a master of acoustic and electric guitar, a lot of different styles, and so he was very much ready to be a serious professional musician, um, someone who was ready to sort of take his place on the national stage by the time he got that opportunity. And he was almost 40 years old before he made his first record. I think he was maybe 37, 38, something like that. So he went, a good part of his life just playing locally, not known outside that little corner of Appalachia. But and another thing about his early recordings, several people talked about how Doc would come to the studio fully prepared. He would have rehearsed. He knew exactly what he wanted to record. He would have rehearsed all the songs thoroughly. In the 70s, there became kind of a thing where people would spend a year in the studio. Doc would spend like 2 days in the studio. He he just really, knew what he wanted to do, came in and did it, and would only take 2 or 3 takes at most to knock a song out. He was a serious professional from the beginning.
That's cool. Mark, I'm going to hand this question to you since you teach at App State on this topic. How do you think that Doc's influence has welcomed new generations into the fold of music?
Sure. Well, I think, Doc was on that. There's another quote in the book where they talk, somebody says he was on that. He was sort of like hearing the Harry Smith anthology. If you don't know what the Harry Smith anthology was, that was a collection of old tunes, fiddle tunes, and sacred tunes, and blues songs, and it was a collection of recordings that were made in the late 20s and early 30s that were reissued on LPs later on, and they helped inspire the folk generation of people who were getting excited about folk music in the 1960s and around the time when Doc was coming onto the scene. And Doc was sort of like a living version of some of these old recordings, but he was able to do it in such a clean and kind of modern way or an updated way that he was able to bridge that gap from sort of in a way like what Kingston Trio would have done with Tom Dooley by kind of making it changing it from the Frank Prophet folk song that was played through Alan Lomax's radio program and making this popular song that could cut through to living rooms all across America and sell a million records. And Doc sort of had that ability of taking old songs and making them sound kind of updated and palatable to the next generation, and also then combining those with something from Tom Paley or a Woody Guthrie song or a Bob Dylan song or something from a more modern tune for that era and making it sound like a folk song that had come through for generations. So he was able to bridge that gap and really influence a whole generation of people. I think we often talk about Doc and his influence on the bluegrass world because of the way he transformed how people approach acoustic guitar and playing hot licks on them. Eddie was talking about how he learned fiddle tunes, and there's the quote in the book that says, "A hot lick on the fiddle is a blazing lick on the guitar." It's one thing to really fire off notes on a fiddle with the bow going in one direction and your fingers rattling off quick tunes, but with a flat pick going up and down and making it clean on the body of a guitar and making that come across is outstanding, is incredible. It's something that people hadn't done like Doc before he came along. But Doc was also hugely influential on just the folk scene the folk song scene as well, and helping transform some of those songs to a new generation. Like Amazing Grace was a song that Doc's version of helped blossom that song back into the folk world. It wasn't one that he invented, and it was one that everybody kind of knew, but once people heard Doc do it, it was like, oh yeah, that makes sense to incorporate into this world of music that people were playing at the time. And so he had that ability to do that. I mean, I remember the first time seeing him in a big auditorium, and he would make you just feel like you were sitting in a room with him, a living room with him, the way he was so casual, but yet it was so like professional and well done. And in turn, you would go see him when I moved to North Carolina in Watauga County, you'd go see him in the park, and it was the exact same person. And it translated to a big stage, where it translated to a small stage. And there's that other part in the book where somebody says that you could have taken him anywhere, and he'd be just as comfortable with a farmer or with a king in a room sitting down. So I think he had that ability to translate to just to anybody, and certainly to that new generation. So he was a gap in between that, or he bridged that gap, and I think that's a big reason why he has inspired such a world beyond. And now you have people like Billy Strings out there who's selling out arenas with his Doc Watson tattoo on his arm, one of his biggest influences. So it certainly is thriving and continuing well into today.
That's very cool. Eddie, do you want to add anything to that? It's hard to beat.
I was going to say Mark covered a lot of ground there. I don't have a lot to add. One thing that did occur to me is, so much is said about Doc's instrumental ability, but I think another factor of what Mark was saying about Doc, sort of, bringing the music, updating the music, bringing it to a new generation. I think part of that was his vocals as well. He had a very smooth, sort of, down to earth, believable, honest sounding, but smooth vocal style. And a lot of those old folk records, like the ones on the anthology of American folk music, which Mark mentioned, those old recordings could be pretty rough. Just sort of nasal voices, heavy accents, just stuff that probably sounded a little grating to modern ears then and now. Like early '60s folk era and today. And Doc just wasn't a really slick, overly produced kind of sound, but it was just a more, you know, a little more palatable, a little more modern sort of sound to a lot of those old songs.
Thank you. I'm going to direct this to you, Eddie. Family was really important to Doc's career and his identity. We know that Doc's family and Rosalie's family were both musically inclined, and then later on in their life, they brought their young children on stage to perform. So, how did this accumulate into Doc and Merle Watson traveling and touring together? And what was daily life like on the road, and their relationship?
Merle didn't show a lot of interest in music early on, from what people told me. He got a drum kit for Christmas when he was a young teenager, and apparently didn't play it very much. But at some point, I think when Doc was out on really his first solo tour, Doc went to New York and Chicago and LA and places like that very early in his sort of national career with Clarence Ashley, who's actually on that anthology we talked about, and some other local musicians. So he kind of went out on the road with a group early on, but by probably late 1963, early 1964, he was out, by himself, which is, that's on a side note, that it was kind of incredible how much he was able to travel by himself as a blind man in that era. But he got home from that first solo tour in the spring of 1964, and Merle had learned to play guitar. Rosalie, Merle's mom, Doc's wife, also was an accomplished guitar player, and she taught Merle his first chords. He decided he wanted to learn, and it's probably a combination of genetics and just all the music in the community and having Doc Watson in your house. But Merle was really good right off the bat, and Doc said, basically, you want to go on the road with me? And Merle was only 16, and he dropped out of school and went on the road. They played their first show together at a outdoor show in a park in San Francisco in front of 12,000 people, I think it was. That was Merle's debut on stage at age 16. So, but yeah, Merle was just old enough to drive at that point and became the driver, and just kind of had to lead Doc around. As accomplished as Doc was, as great a carpenter as he was, as much of an electrician as he was, and of course, amazing musician, he still needed a lot of help on the road. He needed somebody to guide him to the bathroom. He needed somebody to read menus for him. He needed somebody to show him around his hotel room to get him oriented. And Merle did all that for years. But apparently they got along really well. The relationship deteriorated as the '70s went along, and Merle started having some substance abuse issues. And he was a bit of a wild character as well, and that sort of frayed the relationship between Doc and Merle. But Doc always said Merle was his best friend, and then they logged probably hundreds of thousands of miles on the road together, and who knows how many shows. And it was a very close relationship, and a pretty amazing musical relationship as well.
That's really
A
cool.
little side note. Eddie mentions this project in his book, the end of his book, but it's not the easiest thing to come by. But if you can track one of these down, there's a recording of Merle. I think it's like the day after he learned his first chords from his mother. His mother, Rosalie, is the one who showed him his first chords, but they did a little home recording of him jamming out like the next day. And anyway, it's kind of fun to listen to, and really incredible to hear how his progression goes over the next just small number of years, really, to where Merle becomes from sort of part-time sideman with Doc on the stage to really equal footing on in terms of performing.
Absolutely. And Merle played a lot of the solos on their records. And several people, including Marty Stewart and Sam Bush, said that Merle was the best slide guitar player they ever heard. So Merle did not take a back seat to Doc, but like Doc, he was not necessarily, music was not his first choice as a career. Doc kind of felt like that was the only way he could make money. Merle felt like he had other options. He really liked building houses. He liked working with his hands. And people told me that Merle felt like music was more, he felt like it should be a hobby, that it's something you do with your friends and family. And he had a hard time taking it seriously as a profession. And that was also sort of a little bit of friction in terms of him being a professional musician, being out on the road as much as he had to be out with Doc.
Um, how did the death of Merle Watson impact Doc's life, and how has that memorial music festival known as Merle Fest continue to impact music and culture in North Carolina? I'm going to hand it to Mark first.
Sure. Well, I mean, that was one of the seminal events, I would say, in Doc's life, losing his son. His traveling partner, as Eddie said, he, referred to him as his best friend, and compadre, on the road and for professionally and at home with family. And so it was huge. And I think it was huge on not only for him, but for Rosalie, for his wife. And so that meant for life at home. Doc initially couldn't see himself moving on professionally, but also quickly probably realized he couldn't see himself staying at home and not going out and doing that. So that's what he did. He, picked back up and went on the road and found some people like Jack Lawrence and David Holt and Charles Welsh and other friends to go out and be his road companions with him. But that was huge, yeah. And uh, of course, the legacy in terms of North Carolina, one of the big legacies from that is certainly Merle Fest, which started with essentially a fundraiser for a garden project at the community college, with some people performing on the back of a flatbed truck to one of the premier music festivals in the country for Americana music, with 75,000 attendees showing up, and big corporate sponsors, and a beautiful community college campus that can host, a dozen stages and tens of thousands of people for a weekend of music. So, pretty amazing legacy. It's probably the biggest economic driver in Wilkes County. So, I mean, having its a lasting mark in a number of ways, incredible musical collaborations and performances, and many of those have been documented over the years. So that festival has left a big footprint. I certainly remember my first experience moving to North Carolina and how excited my wife and I were to go to camp out at what they call the sewers across the road and in the woods, and take the school buses over from the local scouts to get into the festival. And I mean, it was just so exciting to walk around, and for somebody who at that time, for my wife and I, we were just really diving into this music and this world of Americana music, and there's nothing better than Merle Fest if that's what if that's what your thing is. So it's a pretty special event, and certainly has a legacy in this part of the world.
Have you been every year since?
No, I haven't been every year. I haven't been every year. No, but certainly many times, and it holds a special place in my heart. Yeah.
I like that story. Eddie, what about you? Are you a Merle Fest regular?
I have been several times. I wouldn't say I'm a regular. It's To be honest with you, I'm not a huge fan of sort of that big a festival. I kind of like seeing, one or two shows, one or two bands at a time, one or two singers at a time. But it's incredibly well run. It's a phenomenal festival. I'm not disparaging the festival in any way. It's just not my favorite way to hear music sometimes. So, but I've had a great time. I've been going since the early '90s, on and off, and seeing just I can't tell you how many amazing performances there from. Oh God, let's see. I mean, Doc many times, Steve Earle, Brandy Carlisle, Dolly Parton has played there, members of Led Zeppelin, Elvis Costello, the Waybacks with their album hour every year. Just, it's hard to know where to start talking about, who all has played there, how great the performances are. It's a phenomenal festival.
But we also should, of course, I will tout a little bit of our Doc Watson Day
Please.
program here in Boone. But prior to Doc Watson Day, we also have the Music Fest in Sugar Grove, which is another sort of homegrown music festival that takes place here in Watauga County. So Merle Fest takes place in our neighboring county in Wilkes County, and Deep Gap, where the Watson family was from, is in Watauga County towards Wilkes County. But the Watauga County celebration became the Music Fest in Sugar Grove, and that takes place at our old Cove Creek School, where they have a Doc Watson museum out there. And it did incur some flooding in this last October, so unfortunately, this year's event won't be held out there. But I hope people have it. Doc Watson fans who come to visit have an opportunity to go out and see it. In the museum, they have recreated Doc's stereo, his living room stereo, and bookshelf and casing, and they have lots of really great artifacts from him. And so it's a pretty special and smaller festival, much smaller than Merle Fest, with just a couple stages, more than two performances, but something on a little smaller scale. And then when the statue of Doc Watson was erected in downtown Boone and installed, we started the Doc Watson Day celebration, and Doc came and joined us, and it was one of his last public performances in Boone, and it was so exciting to have him, and to have him go and sit next to the statue and get his picture made. And in the next number of months, he lived about another 9 or 10 months after that, and there were dozens of sightings of Doc bringing friends by to go and see the statue and to show it to them. And I think he was very proud, even though he was humble and he did want there to ensure that there was a sign that said just one of the people. He was certainly was, but one of the special ones. And so he liked to bring people and show off his statue. And so, yeah.
That's cool.
This
And when
Doc
is
Watson
Doc
Day, which you
Watson
can come a
Day?
free concert the third Friday in August. We celebrate Doc Watson Day.
Okay. Okay, it's coming up. It's
Yeah,
coming up.
right here in Boone, a free show. Eddie will be here with some books,
Okay. Yeah,
so people
everyone
can
come
come
west.
up and say hey.
I was
Well,
going to
those of
mention
you that are
the statue. Oh, go ahead.
oh, go ahead.
Just briefly, I was going to say that you're talking about Doc bringing people to see the statue. Riley Bogus has done several of these events with me. Tremendous musician and instrument maker, and you can find on YouTube. Riley tells the story of when Doc took him to the statue. And it's funny and it's touching, and great story there. I highly recommend people track that down.
Doc put his hand on his statue and he said, "I bet I know which one of us weighs more."
Well, those of you that are listening and participating, we've got a couple more questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions from you. And so please add them to the chat function, and we'll get to them soon. So second to last question, and I'm going to start with Mark and then go to Eddie. What are the lasting legacies of Doc Watson's life and career?
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly one that needs to be talked about is his contribution to guitar playing in the acoustic world. There were people who took guitar breaks and solos and who picked things on the guitar, whether with flat pick or finger picking. But Doc kind of took that to another level that inspired, a generation beyond him to do that. And I don't know that we would have the blazing solos that we do from people like Brian Sutton and from um, uh, Billy Strings and these generations that have come after him, without Doc kind of paving that way and having woodshedded. And I mean, he was essentially playing dances and there wouldn't be a fiddler, so he needed to fill in and play those melodies. So it was a very Appalachian thing. He was just being industrious. He needed to get the job done, so he figured out how to do it. There wasn't somebody to show him the way, so he figured it out. And so I think that ingenuity is that's a very mountain thing. Not that it's exclusive to the mountains, but it certainly is something that people who lived in this part of the world had to figure some stuff out on their own. And Doc did that, and he did it in such a way that it could translate to people beyond, and it has, and it's really taken hold. So I think that is one of Doc's important legacies that we see continuing on. And the other, I do think is that he found this way to make folk music both comfortable and approachable, but also like I don't want to say it like I think Eddie, you maybe said the same thing. Like it's not that it's slick. It's not slick exactly, but it is too. I mean, he was such a pro. The way he could tell a story, the way he could introduce a song. I think there's that Bear Sonic Journals. Eddie mentions that recording towards the end of his book. It's some of these great live recordings. It was 6 nights of Doc and Merle and some friends playing these concerts, and they kept the recorder on, and you can hear him introducing songs and following songs up, and his humor on the stage. And the other one being this legacy project that came later on with Doc a little later in life, and it's hosted and emceed by David Holt, who's also kind of in that same category, who can take something and make it feel comfortable and easy and very casual, but it's also very planned and professional. And so he was able to do that and just do it in a way that made you feel like it wasn't being forced on you. It was like, with his sense of humor and his vocal tone and inflections, like Eddie mentioned that, it was so he's so enjoyable and easy to listen to, that it just translates in that way. So anyway, he's inspired generations from doing that.
Absolutely.
Eddie, what do you think his lasting legacies are?
I think Mark covered it really well. I'm having a hard time thinking of much to add to that. Yeah, just he's influenced generations of guitarists and musicians and singers, and just he's been a real sort of shining light for North Carolina. He really helped, is one of maybe a handful of people that really put North Carolina on the musical map, and I think that's an important part of his legacy.
Yeah.
And an important reason for this book, because Eddie and I talked about this once before, but for somebody with such stature and such influence, there's really not that much out there about him, at least in book form. There's certainly lots of recordings and lots of interviews, and Eddie's done a great job of pulling a lot of those together and putting it in a story that is really fun to read. And there's a lot of great stories in here, and I think there's something for people who don't know a lot about Doc. It's a great way to learn about him, and for people who know about him, I mean, I've certainly enjoyed learning lots of little stories about him, and hearing some of the candid way people talked about. The other thing is we often see that stage part of Doc, but Eddie tells some of the behind the stage stuff about traveling, about the challenges of the substance abuse with his sons, and that was real stuff that he dealt with in his life and his career. And I think it's dealt with tastefully and in a kind way, but a real way in this book. So thank you, Eddie, for the contribution to the world. We needed this
Oh,
book.
thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate it.
Legacies continue by those that read. So, last question for both of you. Eddie, what are you working on currently that you want everyone to know about?
Let's see. Do not have another book in the works yet. I hope to write another one eventually, but that's not really on the table at the moment. I guess one of a recent project that I've enjoyed being a part of is I've started doing some writing for the Music Maker Foundation in Hillsborough, and they work with a lot of traditional musicians, older musicians. They have a record label. They record and put out records by people, and they also just help people with things like health insurance and car repair, sort of whatever. There are a lot of musicians out there that, I mean, Doc was not a rich man, but he made a comfortable living playing music, and there are a lot of people that have never sort of reached that stature, but deserve support, and Music Maker Foundation helps those folks. So I'm happy to be involved with them, and otherwise I'm just sort of doing a little bit of writing here and there. I'm helping a family in Rockingham County, North Carolina, put together their family history. I guess that is another book, but it's just a private project for the family. So, and just doing some freelance writing, little bit of everything.
Very cool. Eddie, did you come to the North Carolina Folk Festival?
Oh, I do. Yeah.
In Greensboro.
I was
That's my
actually
plug.
I was on the I guess the artistic advisory I was on. I can't remember the name of the board exactly, but we helped pick the artist in the early years of the folk festival, and just I don't think I've missed one of those so far, except COVID was obviously a hiccup for that and just about everything else. But I think I've managed to make it to every one of the ones that have come off for the North Carolina Folk Festival.
Well, for those of you who have not been, it's in Greensboro every September. So please come.
All
3
free,
days.
amazing talent. Just it's a fantastic festival.
Mm-hmm. All right, Mark, what are you working on that you want everybody to know about?
Well, we just wrapped up our fourth annual Boonerang Music and Arts Festival, which is our free music and arts festival here in Boone. But coming up, we do have our Doc Watson Day coming up this summer. We have a summer full of concerts here at the Jones House in downtown Boone, and lots of other fun community events like our July 4th parade and things like that. So we just hope people have an opportunity to come up to the high country and remind everybody that we are open for business up here. There's certainly still some work to be done out in a lot of parts of the county, but things are open. So we hope people come up and enjoy the mountains. It's cool up here, folks.
Yes, take a break, go west, spend money, cool off.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for this conversation. That was the questions that we prepared, but I'm starting to see some trickle in. So I'm going to hand it back to Melissa, who is going to moderate the questions from the participants.
Thank you, Cecelia. Yes, I am here, and we have some fantastic audience questions that have come in, and we'll get to as many as we can. So we've got a question that asks, kind of in the same vein, did Doc write any of his own music or lyrics, and maybe what are some of his original tunes that he's known for?
Well,
Do you
let's
want to go
see.
ahead? I'll just show
There we
this
go.
off while you're talking.
Thanks for bringing the visual aids, by the way, Mark. This is a big
Yeah,
help.
for sure.
Yeah, there are a few of Doc's early songs that he actually wrote. Most of his recordings, most of what he played on stage were songs by either traditional songs or songs by contemporary songwriters, like Townes Van Zandt. He was a big fan of Townes, Dylan. Just I'm trying to remember. There was a guy in the '70s he did several songs by. I'm blanking on the name at the moment, but he had a wide range of tastes and interests. And but yeah, he did write occasionally. I'd say the most famous song that Doc had a hand in writing, wrote with Rosalie. Rosalie wrote the bulk of it, and Doc helped her finish it. Is called Your Lone Journey, which is frequently mistitled as Your Long Journey. But she wrote that while she was sweeping one day in the early 60s. Riley Bogus told her, Rosalie, you should sweep a lot more often. Because it's a terrific song. It's about sort of missing someone out on the road, which Rosalie did a lot with Doc out on the road. It's been recorded by a lot of people. One of the best known versions was by Robert Plant and Alison Krauss, and Riley actually played on that record. But yeah, anything you'd like to add to that, Mark?
That is a beautiful song. Yeah, some of the others are in this. I was holding this book up because this recording, which includes 4 CDs, has a bunch of home recordings that Doc made, including some of his songs that didn't really get put out onto. I guess maybe did Chic of Air maybe get put out on a little 45? He had maybe one song that got put out on a 45, but
I think that was a cover as well. I think that was like a jazz song from the
was it okay?
vaudeville song, something like that, maybe.
Well, but at any rate, there are a couple of his compositions that come on these home recordings that weren't released on records. So, um, yeah, there's a couple instrumental pieces that a lot of people like to play. Doc's guitar
Mhm.
is or I think that's the name of it. The piece that
That's right. Yeah.
he would warm up with it behind backstage. That was kind of a sort of a pattern, a picking pattern that he liked to do before he would go out to perform. That he ended up crafting into an instrumental piece that a lot of people still like to play today. So a couple instrumental pieces and certainly his own take on some things like the way that he plays Deep River Blues was how
Hmm.
he heard two guitar players playing a duet guitar piece, and he didn't realize it was two players, and he tried to figure out how he could do it as by himself. So, and his way of playing it has become kind of a standard way that guitar players like to play that tune now. So
And he
not
said
his, but
learning Merle Travis songs helped him figure out how to play that.
right.
His version of originally called Big River Blues, but he changed it to Deep River Blues by the Delmore Brothers.
Perfect. I think that goes well into our next question, which is just sort of what makes Doc's style of playing, right? He's a master of style. What makes that so unique? So Eddie or Mark, whoever would like to start off with that.
I think part of what makes Doc's playing so unique is how clean it is. And what I mean by that is it's really easy when you're playing acoustic instruments and you start to pick up the pace for the notes to kind of wash together. And Doc leaves these little micro spaces between his notes that make it just pop in a way that you can really hear the melody in a distinct way. It's not muddy, if you will. And that's something that just takes a lot and a lot of practice and experience in doing because it's such a micro movement to be able to get those notes clean in that way and match up your two hands together as you strike the note and mute it in just enough time to strike the next note and mute it in just enough time to strike the next note and doing that in a quick succession is something that when you hear a guitar player do it, sometimes you'll hear a bluegrass band and it's hard to hear the guitar player cut through with a solo, and sometimes that's because the guitar player doesn't isn't quite doing it like the way of Doc Watson or a Brian Sutton or some of these players that you will hear cut through in a way. I think it has to do with that spacing of the notes, and Doc could do that just in an incredible way.
Another thing that about his guitar playing that several people talked about is just how perfect his rhythm was. That his rhythm was always, just like a metronome. That he and I think a lot of that had to do with, playing for 20 25 minutes at a time at square dances early on. He really learned how to keep a very steady rhythm, and that really never left him throughout his career.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Um, let's see, we've got a lot of questions here. So, during your research, Eddie, was there anything that you learned about Doc that surprised you? And maybe Mark, as you read, was there anything that surprised you that came up? So, Eddie.
I've already talked about some of his Mark and I both mentioned some of his other skills besides music. I think that was one of the biggest surprises was for instance him wiring his own house back in the 50s. they sent somebody out from the electrical co-op to check behind him, just make sure it was safe and done properly. And the guy from the co-op said it was one of the best wiring jobs he'd ever seen. There was very little Doc couldn't do when he put his mind to it. And so that, I guess that was one of the biggest surprises to me, was just all, how skilled he was, how accomplished he was in other areas besides music.
Mark, anything to add? Anything surprising gleaned about
Um, I don't know that I'd say there was anything that was surprising. Yeah, I mean, I feel like, yeah, nothing's coming to mind in that way, but I did enjoy learning about, like the Helen Keller experience. I hadn't heard about that before, and that was so I guess that was a surprise, and that was fun. But I really just loved reading about, his experience through the flood. I think Cecilia mentioned that in the book, and that certainly, was poignant reading that after last fall, reading about how Eddie described the 1940 flood experience with the Watson family and their community. And reading about his life on the road, like I said, I mean, I feel like those years, there always seemed to be a lot to talk about with Doc and getting discovered by Ralph Rensler, and the experience of, he was playing the electric and they got him an acoustic, and then he went on the road, and he met with Joan, did some shows with Joan Baez, and or I mean, not Joan Baez, I mean, Gene Ritchie, and these early experiences that he had on the road. And then it's sort of like, and then Merle joined, and then they toured together, and then Merle died. And it was like that whole period in there of the career blossoming with Merle. I feel like that was it was really enjoyable to read about that a little, in a little bit more breadth, because I don't feel like that era of Doc's life was really covered a lot prior to this, or
I'm glad to hear
at
that,
least
Mark.
in one
Yeah.
place. So that was really nice.
And I think those are some of the happiest years too, that probably mid 60s to mid 70s were kind of after he was discovered and before some of the trouble with Merle. I think that was, some of the happiest years musically and personally in his life.
It's
And so it's
so good.
nice to dive
Oh,
into
that
that a little bit.
yeah. I mean, that era of Doc is just the it's the best. So good.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, great.
And I think
Thank
that's incredibly well documented. You mentioned the recordings, the 7 nights or whatever it was in San Francisco. It's called
Yeah.
Never the Same Way Once.
Yeah.
And it's many CDs, something like 7 CDs, and just there's a lot of repeats on there, but it all sounds amazing. And I think that's one of the best just documents of that era for Doc and Merle and T. Michael Coleman, and just some of his peak Doc performances.
Yeah. They're having so much fun, and the repertoire is all there. And anyway, it's great. So good. Yeah.
awesome. Thank you. So we have a viewer who said they were looking for and found in the book very kind of personal connections that they had with Doc, and they reference appearances for the Bristol Session 75th anniversary and his friendship with Wayne Henderson. And I think one of the things that the book does such a good job of is capturing how many people kind of Doc seemed to know everybody. So maybe talk about his collegiality, his friendships within the music industry, and maybe how you came to kind of get all these different views and impressions of his life.
Just sort of one at a time for Doc meeting these people and for me talking to these people. I think just he was on the road for decades and was a big influence, was a sort of sought after musician in places like New York and Nashville and Los Angeles, and you meet a lot of musicians that way. So that was a big part of it, I think. Let's see. Um, and just he was a very easygoing, friendly person. People would talk about, they would see Doc. He would, despite being blind, they would walk up and just say a couple of words, and he would go, "Oh, hey Betty, how are you?" He would remember people just by the sound of their voice from someone he hadn't seen in 10 years. And with all his travels, all the people he met, he had quite a memory, and just made people feel very very appreciated. And I think that contributed to him having a lot of friends. He made a lot of very interesting friendships. he was Merle was friends with the daughter of Elia Kazan, the movie director who directed On the Waterfront and Facing the Crowd, the fantastic Andy Griffith movie. And Doc and Merle would stay at Kazan's home in Connecticut, and he had a brownstone in New York that they would stay at. Just, he made it all sorts of connections over the years, and it it paid off in terms of um, just support from a lot of people. He got a lot of support from a man in Philadelphia early on at a point when he was thinking seriously about quitting the road. Once again, I'm blanking on the name, but it was a man involved with the Second Fred in Philadelphia that was a huge, just gave Doc a big boost when he really needed it. And there were a lot of people like that in Doc's life, people that would just support him, give him a place to stay, feed him on the road, and just make his life a little easier when he was away from home.
Mark, anything to add about Doc's ability to sort of cultivate friendships throughout his
Yeah.
musical career?
Well, it's fun living in Boone and hearing the stories of all the people that would see him. The one of the frequent places was at the vacuum shop. I'm not sure why he always hung out at the vacuum shop, but that was a place that apparently there were lots of Doc encounters. He used
There
to
were
play
jam sessions. People talked about jam sessions at the vacuum
at the
shop.
vacuum
So
shop, yeah.
that was part of it. Yeah.
He would hang out at Little's music store across the street, and so there's lots of great stories about him hanging out in Little's music store and people meeting him and visiting with him there. Of course, there's fun lore about him discovering, Old Crow Medicine Show on the street in Boone, busking on the street and meeting them on the streets in Boone. And so I think he certainly lived a little bit of a celebrity life in Boone, but had enough friends that he was still comfortable to be able to get out and do the things that he did. But I will say that he also could be a little cantankerous at times. When we did the Doc Watson statue unveiling, now this is on me, but I'll tell you my Doc Watson encounter story. Um, I had arranged with David Holt for Doc to come and perform that day. And he was kind of who I had been working with to arrange to have Doc at the Jones house. And I was explaining to Doc, Rosalie was in the hospital or in the nursing home at the time. And I was explaining to David that Doc's cousin, also a David, was going to come out and say a prayer for Rosalie before we brought Doc out. And I was telling him, and Doc was sitting not far away and heard me explaining to David what was happening, but I wasn't telling him directly. So he said, what's that, son? And so I kind of leaned down close to Doc and I got a little louder and I said, well, Doc, your cousin Dave. And he said, I'm blind, son, not deaf. So, um, anyway, but it was good. And you can watch a little bit of that performance on our Jones House YouTube channel. There's an edited video of Doc performing that day. And he used to do oh I'm blanking on the name of the song right now. I think we have it on that YouTube thing. I can't remember if we released it or not, but it was really beautiful. He of course was not in his prime. These were in the last months of his life. And his playing was not the hot guitar licks of his youth, but his singing that day was so beautiful, and hearing the way that he sang as an older man was just like really touching. So I encourage people to go and look up some of his performances in his last couple years. It's pretty special.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, a lot more questions here. We've got a really great, inquisitive audience tonight. We have some fantastic stories being shared in the chat about how folks might not know how well known he was internationally, that they were traveling in the Mediterranean, and one of Doc's songs was playing in a gift shop, and they had to tell the store owners, "Hey, we're from the same state that Doc's from." So, not only nationally known and recognized, but internationally known as well. Uh,
Nice.
so what would Doc think of his old recordings, those not previously released, being released after his death?
I would think if the money is supporting his family, he'd be all for it. Um, I don't think there's anything that I've ever heard that was put out of Doc that he would feel uncomfortable about.
Eddie,
And as
anything?
Mark mentioned early on in the session, Doc was very accomplished by the time he started recording professionally. So yeah, I doubt there's anything that would really embarrass him or make him feel, like it should not have been released. I'd be surprised.
The only thing I could think that might even touch on some of that is there's some of these recordings on this project where Doc was multi-tracking himself. And so it's him playing several instruments and singing harmony with himself, and he never chose to put those recordings out. So those came out kind of as these home recordings, but with the blessing of his daughter, who would have had his trust, and so
And I
I
think
don't think
that
that
I
he
think
would. I don't think he would have
yeah,
balked at them, but these would be the closest thing to like a maybe not like fully, you know, doc stamped and ready to release project. This might be the
that's a good
closest
point.
thing to that.
And that was actually another surprise to me was that he was able to figure out a way to multi-track himself in the 50s with home recording equipment. I'm sure that was a challenge back in those days.
Yeah.
All right. Great, thank you. We'll do a couple more questions here for you. So we have a question from the audience. How did he get his name, Doc?
He was playing in Lenore, not too far from Blowing Rock, not too far from, where he lived. And this was 1941, I think. He was 18 years old, and he was playing with, was it Paul Greer? I think they were playing together. And this was for WHKY out of Hickory, North Carolina. But they were doing a broadcast from the front window of a furniture store in Lenore, Lutz Furniture. And the announcer said, "Your Paul's got a good radio name, nice and short, but your name, we need a better radio name for you." Doc's real name was Arthel, Arthel, which I've never heard of anyone else named Arthel. And the announcer just thought it was kind of an odd name and wanted a short and sweet radio name for Doc. And a 13 or 14-year-old girl in the crowd just yelled, "Call him Doc." And he was Doc from then on. The family still, family and friends still called him Arthur quite a bit over the years, but, he was largely known as Doc from that day forward, I think. And I don't think anybody really knows. I never found anybody who knew who the girl was. I did talk to um, Kay and Patrick Crouch introduced me to a local musician named Carolina Ray Wisnut, who was there that day. So I got to talk to him. He was, got his firsthand account of being there that day, but he didn't know who the girl was. Nobody else I talked to knew who the girl was. So I never got her firsthand account of it. But the best guess is that it was because of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes' assistant was Dr. Watson. So that may be what inspired her.
Mark, any additional thoughts on Doc in his naming?
No, that's the story for sure that I've always heard, the one that Eddie recounts in the book. Yeah.
All right. The origin story is consistent. Okay, so Eddie, this I think is for you. You mentioned that your previous book is on John Prines. Maybe you could do a quick, I'm sure that's not easy, but a quick maybe comparison of the subjects of your books, John Prine and Doc Watson.
Okay. Let's see. Um, both, I think both were kind of what you see is what you get, sort of people. Both very down to earth, funny. Um, both could be a little cranky, but just people that you would enjoy talking to. I think the average person would enjoy talking to. And both very talented in somewhat different ways. John Prine was an excellent guitar player. He died during COVID, unfortunately, died in 2020 of COVID or complications from COVID. He had some other health issues as well. But he was an excellent fingerstyle guitar player, and by coincidence, Prine's family was from the same county in Kentucky as Merle Travis, who was again a big influence on Doc, and who Merle Watson was named after. Um, and so, John Prine was a good finger picker, but Prine was known primarily as a songwriter, which Doc was not, and I think that's the biggest difference. Prine's legacy is certainly his songs. And the one that people probably know best is "Angel from Montgomery," which Bonnie Raitt recorded and has played, you know, perpetually since the early 1970s. Um, he has an amazing duet with Iris DeMent called "In Spite of Ourselves," which is a dearly loved song by many people, sort of slightly profane love song between sung by John Prine and Iris DeMent. When he first presented her with it, she said, "My mother's going to hear this." She was a little nervous about recording it, but Prine did not take credit, but he did co-write. I think "You Never Even Called Me by My Name," which David Allan Coe had a big hit with in the '70s, sort of a country music parody. But yeah, Prine, I could go on, but Prine wrote a ton of amazing songs, and made a lot of great albums from the '70s to up until 2018, shortly before his death. So yeah, somewhat different. Actually, there is one interesting overlap between Prine and Doc. Is Doc was on Sugar Hill Records out of Durham, North Carolina, and we just lost Barry Poss, the founder and president of Sugar Hill, just a couple of weeks ago. Barry was a terrific guy and a big help to me with a lot of projects over the years. But Doc started recording for Sugar Hill in the mid '80s, and Prine talked to Barry about recording for Sugar Hill around that same time. But he said he learned so much from talking to Barry that he decided, well, I'll just make my own label. I don't need to record for anybody else. So Sugar Hill, Barry Poss and Sugar Hill sort of inspired John Prine to start Oh Boy Records in the early 1980s.
Okay. Mark, any thoughts on John Prine and Doc Watson?
No, I mean, I kind of think of them as both in the maybe larger Americana bubble, but yeah, like Eddie said, um, Brian is really a songwriter and Doc is really a song interpreter.
Good distinction. All right. I think this will be our last question of the evening, unless if you have any more questions, you can pop those in the chat or the Q&A. But this last question here that we have is, how did Doc reflect the values and culture of the Deep Gap area in his life and music?
Hmm,
So whoever would
that's a
like to
great question.
tackle that is a really good question.
Mark, you live much closer to Deep Gap than I do. You wanna start on this one?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that one thing in my class, I talk about Doc as being the consummate Appalachian musician. And the reason I talk about him in that way is that he brings both tradition to the table. He does carry on the traditions of his community and his family, his church community, the musical and cultural fabric of those things. But he's also, like people in the region, and I mentioned this before, have always been inventive and cutting edge as well, because they had to be. And he was very much that. He was inventive and cutting edge. He soaked up the influences from the radio and from records and from the people he encountered on the road and from everywhere he could. And so he he made things his own, but he also didn't take them and go to Nashville. He didn't take them and go to Los Angeles. He took them out in the world and he brought them back to Deep Gap. And he took them back out to the world and he took it back to Deep Gap. And he never, even in his you look through his album covers as he started to get some success in the years, and none of them are, he's not wearing rhinestones. There's nothing showy. There's nothing, it's very much, I think he would feel comfortable showing his mama any of his, except for maybe the one where they're sitting with the beers on the table. I don't know if his mama would have approved of that one, but, that pretty much, I mean, I think any of his work, like when somebody asked, would he have been proud of the things that he did when he was younger, or how would he feel about that stuff being released? I think he would have been perfectly okay with all of it because he kept a dignity about his career and his music and his presentation of it. That really, he would speak of home and he would speak of it. He didn't talk about it in a Yahoo way or in some kind of a country bumpkin way, or there was no he would have not fit in with Hee Haw, even though he would have been great friends with Grandpa Jones and would have loved the musicians on there. He that wouldn't have been the vibe for Doc. There was just a little more dignity about the way that he presented things. Not that there wasn't a sense of humor, but it was a different kind of a presentation, and I think that is really a very like true Western North Carolina Appalachian kind of a vibe.
All right. Eddie, would you like to add on to that?
once again, Mark really summed it up quite well there, so I don't have a lot to add. Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly about that. You know, Doc was not presenting this sort of country bumpkin hee-haw sort of image. It was a very dignified. Just I think he did maybe might have turned some people's heads in terms of what North Carolina mountain people were like, because the era he came along, there were a lot of hillbilly stereotypes, a lot of sort of Beverly hillbillies, Gomer Pyle, Darlin family on Andy Griffith show, just a lot of um, just again sort of hillbilly country bumpkin stereotypes, Green Acres, that sort of thing. And Doc presented a very different picture of someone with a sense of humor, someone who didn't take himself that seriously, but presented himself in a more refined, dignified sort of way.
I'm gonna hop back on here. So that will conclude. It looks like that concludes our audience questions. They had some really great questions for you both. So thank you to the audience for asking those questions and really digging deep on this topic and sharing all your stories of how you personally connected with Doc and the music and the region. I've enjoyed seeing those come up in the chat. So I want to say thank you to Eddie and to Mark for their conversation this evening, and to Cecelia for her excellent job of moderating that conversation. And thank you to our wonderful audience again for attending. We had groups and individuals. I saw folks from all over North Carolina and many different states across the country attending tonight, and for asking all of your questions. We appreciate your time and engagement. At the conclusion of the event, those of you who registered with an email address will receive a brief survey to complete. We would greatly appreciate you completing this survey to hear your feedback on this program. Please visit our website at www.nchumanities.org to learn more about our other upcoming events and to subscribe to our email newsletter to stay up to date with all NC Humanities news and programs. So thank you everyone for attending, and have a good evening.